Great. So I am supporting the First Nations Public Service Secretariat, or FNPSS, which is hosting this data-related series. The First Nations Public Service Secretariat's mission is to strengthen and enhance capacity in First Nations communities and organizations in British Columbia. And FNPSS activities focus on building core public service excellence in governments and administration through training, webinars, and projects. And if you haven't been to the FNPSS website or checked out some of the events and training, I'd encourage you to do that. I'll put the link in the chat. And I suspect at this point, many of you are more than familiar with Zoom. You're all here, so you've made the first step at least. But just to make sure we're all on the same page for this session, I would encourage you all to click your, before you do this, I'll say the whole thing, but click unmute yourself, say hello in your language, and then remute yourselves. That'll be our first Zoom test. So if you want to go ahead right now, unmute and say hello in your language.
Hello.
Joella siya
Hello.
Bonjour.
Hello.
Oh, yeah.
Hello.
Amazing. That was wonderful. Thank you all for doing that. And you've all passed the first Zoom test, and we got so many languages in there. I would love to count. Next, I wanted to just draw your attention to the raise hand function. Depending on what version of Zoom you're working with, under mine, if I click the reactions button at the bottom, there is a raise hand button, and it looks like this. And then I can also do the same thing and lower my hand. You might find that function by clicking on the participants list. And then when you, at the bottom, one of the buttons is raise hand. So maybe you all want to give that a try right now, just raising and then lowering your hand. Just make sure you get the idea. Great. Okay, so if you could all lower your hands now, because what you can see is that your image bumps up to the top so that we know to have you ask your question. There we go. Okay, excellent. So I'm really happy today to introduce our speakers, Gwen Phillips and Christopher Horsethief, who are going to share more stories and information than you thought possible. And before I introduce them, I wanted to let you know that this series is part of the implementation process for the First Nations Data Governance Strategy, FNDGS. Some of you might have been at engagement sessions, either in BC or elsewhere in the province related to the implementation of this strategy. The strategy also includes the formation of a data center that will serve BC First Nations and governments. And I think the same applies to other provinces if you're joining us from other parts of Canada. This particular summer knowledge sharing series is being organized by the First Nations Information Governance Center, FNIGC, and the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative, BCFNDGI, with the longest acronym and the most great resources on their website. This series is being held to begin assisting First Nation governance in building capacity in data governance and information management. So I will leave it to Gwen to share a little bit more about the series and this particular session. I wanted to let you know, for those of you who don't know Gwen, she is a citizen of the Ktunaxa Nation and has worked for the Ktunaxa Nation Council for the past 38 years, holding a variety of senior management roles and at times overseeing departments of education, health, corporate services, traditional knowledge, and language. The past 2 decades, Gwen has been part of a team that is leading the Ktunaxa Nation back to self-government. She founded the BC First Nation Data Governance Initiative, a tripartite government initiative, which includes federal, provincial, and First Nation governments, with a key objective being that federal, provincial, and First Nation governments have timely access to quality data to plan, manage, and account for investments and outcomes associated with well-being. As a member of the First Nations Information Governance Center Board, Gwen also champions data governance at the national level on behalf of all BC First Nations. And with that, I will hand it over to Gwen, who will also introduce our second speaker, Christopher. Gwen.
Thank you, Bronwyn. And I'd just like to take a pause at this time to make a quick thanks. I want to thank the Creator for bringing us together, and I thank the Creator for all the gifts, basically, that we've been bestowed upon us As Smuckinick in Canada, as Canadian First Nations people, we are fairly blessed in context of global issues. So to give thanks for the blessings we have and this time together, and ask the Creator to look upon us as the humble humans we are, and to guide us as we move forward together. Also to lay hands on those requiring love and protection in these times that we've never experienced. So thank you to the Creator for bringing us together today. I'd also like to thank every one of you for taking time this morning. Data governance, data sovereignty are concepts that are kind of almost foreign to us, but not at all when we really get to understand them. And I think that this is a time for us that we've never had. So this series of webinars is actually going to sort of cascade from a concept of data sovereignty to data governance, right down to records and information management. So the three of them will cascade in looking at governance, sovereignty at the level of nationhood, governance at the level of governing bodies, and then looking at the connection down to records and information management as we carry out our daily activities as governments. And so the first webinar today, I'll co-host with Dr. Christopher Horsethief, a citizen who I've had the privilege and pleasure of working with for almost 30 years now. We're growing old together, the two of us. I was giggling. It's like a thing we've watched ourselves become who we are. And Dr. Horsethief is an individual who really has been working in the domain of academia and the global intellectual property domain, and really recognizes the challenges that have been in that area. My expertise or my activity is primarily focused at the nation level in nation rebuilding and community development and data to support those activities. So today's webinar is going to be delivered in two parts. The first part, Christopher's going to basically focus on the Ktunaxa Nation's experience and his being an academic who has helped to guide the Ktunaxa Nation for the past 27 years, and then myself. In the work that I've been doing alongside of him. We'll take the second part of the presentation, focusing in on how we can work collectively to do what the Ktunaxa Nation is intending to do, but what other nations are also doing, and what really I think the time is right to do, and the opportunity is just presenting itself. So this will be a sort of a two-part webinar, and Dr. Christopher Horsethief will begin the presentation this morning, focusing a bit more on that high-level academic concepts. So thank you.
Hello, thank you for that introduction, Gwen. I generally work nights, so if I look super tired right now, it's because I'm super tired right now. I'm located in Spokane, Washington, the very southern part of our traditional territory, and an overlap with a number of the interior Salish groups from Eastern Washington. And I'm happy to be here talking about this particular topic. I want to just give you a brief summary before I start. The one thing I've learned over 27 years is that Indigenous people have a vast wealth of knowledge. Even those that think they don't know anything, they know a ton. When it comes to working with researchers, when it comes to working with data scientists or technicians, the primary source of bias in those conversations is a hypervigilance. It's Indigenous people always worried about, if I share this with you, what are you going to do with it? If I share this with you, does it become yours to keep? I worked with a number of graduate students from the interior of British Columbia that said, I'm never going to go to graduate school because I'm never going to give my data to the institution. I'm never going to give my data to the master's program in this or the PhD in that, because my community can't do that. And what I told them was, your community doesn't have to do that. Have your governance structure, whether it's your traditional knowledge and language program, or whether it's the Anaukin Center or whoever it is, have them sponsor your work so you do the research and you give it to them. It becomes a part of your community. And then you just cite that work when it comes time to writing your thesis or your dissertation. It never has to become anyone else's property other than yours. The one thing that I've noticed when people start to think about that, they get more comfortable. Once they realize that they can talk about their community's data without having it automatically become someone else's property, they're less hyper vigilant. We lost our kids, which became a tool for changing who we were. We've lost our place names so they could be replaced on maps in other languages. We've lost many of those resources. And so it gets increasingly difficult to ask people to give that intellectual property, the very last few things that truly belong to them. But once you start reminding people, just because you talk about it doesn't mean you lose it. And the more comfortable you are with setting those boundaries in your conversation, whether they're with governance structures, whether they're with intertribal projects, whether they are cross-cultural barriers, if you're just firm from the beginning that this belongs to my community, I'm not giving it to you, it belongs to me and it's a part of who I am, then they're able to talk about those things without having that same kind of bias. And frankly, I think you get a more comprehensive and well-rounded set of data from the beginning. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about here. And I'm going to kind of bring up a few specific things our community has had some success with. This December, it will have been 27 years, which almost seems pretty unreal. So I'm going to be thinking that's going to be on my head the whole time I'm presenting, trying to do the mental math there. So yeah, if we could, I'm not sure if I can control the slides or if we could advance to the next one. Okay, right here. Yeah, so I want to start with this idea, the idea of intellectual property law in Canada, and I think this applies in the States, and really I think this applies just about anywhere in the world where there are Indigenous people that are always talking about data kind of in reflection of and reaction to these larger structures going on around them that are built to take, parse, ingest, and use low context information. That means information that can be written down and it doesn't really matter where it came from. We all know in our communities, it doesn't work like that. The information in my community doesn't just belong to me, it belongs to my family. It's been maintained for 13,000 years, down through the generations. And so I'm going to compare and contrast a few of those ideas here. Canadian intellectual property law generally has three functions. The first is to protect your brand. So businesses that are building their brand usually need some kind of protection. So if they come up with a new product, they come up with a new logo, the next company can't come along and use something that's very similar to try and gain from that. The best example I think is Coming to America with the golden arcs or whatever it was, where there was the McDonald's logo and there was a guy that did the knockoff logo. So kind of the first aspect of intellectual property is making sure that if you come up with something specific to your business, no one can copy it. The second one is protecting innovation, particularly with respect to data, the role of data and information in research and development. This is talking about identifying whether you need a patent or an industrial design or both to protect your innovation. Why would you put all that money into the research if someone could come along and duplicate your formula and then they don't have to put any money into it and they can come up with your exact same product? So intellectual property law protects the group that is putting the money into research and development so that it remains theirs. And then also protecting artistic creation, protecting original artistic creations, including computer programs. As a person with a tech background that develop apps, I know right now that when I'm pitching a new app to someone, I'm very careful about what I tell them I'm doing and what the internal logics for an app are, because I don't want someone to come along and figure out and backwards iterate their way in and then figure out how to duplicate what I'm doing. So there's some intellectual property law around that as well. If I come up with it and it's something that I've done and it's associated with me, the next person can't just take a version and kind of deconstruct and then come up with their own version of the Durnacha grammar translation app and just put another name on it. These kinds of property laws do not protect Indigenous identity. They have nothing to do with the collective intellectual property. They don't protect our languages, our stories, our songs, our images, our spiritual concepts. In fact, in many ways, the rest of the world, especially in academia, has kind of maintained its identity by sending experts to our community that are used to being able to write something down, take it anywhere they want, do what they want with it, and it becomes a part of their research. And so all of a sudden, now we have this situation where someone can be an expert on Durnacha language that's never spent a day in our community. Someone can be an expert on the way that we understand our creation story through the lens of place names that represent that those different sites. They can become an expert in that just by reading something and taking it away from the community without ever having to have any agreements, any research ethics protocols where they're able to say, okay, we're going to work with you. This is what you get out of it. This is what we expect. We want this all to be written out in such a way that we're all okay with that. And now we're at a situation where that's all a little bit different. Next slide, please. Okay, so now when we're talking about Indigenous intellectual property, a few of the original interviews from maybe 10 years ago, and then recently revisited with our some of our language speakers and our cultural people, we started to refine these ideas a little bit to add a little bit of definition to what was going on in our heads as we were having that emotional reaction to the thought of someone taking our ideas or duplicating them. And we had a series of nice discussions, and a few of the primary differences that came out were as follows. Protecting our identity. Cultural identity belongs to the collective and it's irreducible to the individual. So that's one of those first ideas, where intellectual property in Canada is about identifying an individual and allocating ideas to that person to protect them. That's a big difference in our community because we have a particular story, a part of our oral history. It's not mine to give or become the expert on. I can't do a video and then tell that story and then tell everyone it belongs to me, because really it's been maintained by the entire community and the protocols related to our culture. So I can't just write it down and give it to someone and say, you have the right to use this forever now. I don't have the right to do that because it's irreducible to me. It belongs to the collective. Protecting the foundation for innovation and adaptation. Here, it's not so much a research and development thing, but there's these ideas that we're really starting to explore, that no culture is static. For 11,000 to 13,000 years in our community, we had a process called which is when one group finds things that are valuable enough to pass to the next generation to help them stand firmly. That's one of our words for culture. We've found things that help us to maintain our identity and found a way to pass them on across successive generations. And what that does is that provides our community the information that we need to be able to adapt, but still maintain our identity. It allows us to understand the protocols so that we can negotiate our practices. And this is very different from a law that says, you can protect your resource and your research and development and no one can copy it. This is a tool that we all have access to help us maintain our identity. The last one here is protecting community creation, preserving resources meant for the entire community, not just locally for famous personalities. There's someone from every one of our communities that becomes famous because they tell a story, and the next thing you know, they're on APTN, and now they're starring on some like a made-for-TV movie, and they're sharing, these deep cultural ideas, and everyone thinks that, oh, that person is the medicine person that knows all of this. Well, it's maintained by a community. And when we take that one person and they become the icon for everything, actually what you get is one person, one perspective, a very limited diversity in the way that that information is shared. So intellectual property in our communities also means that what every expert thinks, what they say, what they do is balanced against what all of the experts do. And if you take any one of those and you say, this is it, this is the truth, this is who we are, that's only for one person, and that's not representative of Indigenous people in general, but it's even less representative of a single community. So you'll notice the line at the bottom, I've changed a little bit. Indigenous intellectual property is deeply integrated with your protocols from your community, not some magical generic pan-Indigenous native protocols. These are the protocols from your community that you come from. They protect your identity, where you're from in your community based on kind of your family and where your roots are. It protects your specific language, not all Indigenous languages, your specific language, your stories, your songs, your images, your spiritual concepts. Western science is really good about aggregating all of this data and then giving it different categorical variables and then saying that this is just information. We don't do that in our community. We don't get 3 different people from 3 different groups in the interior together and mix it all together in a pot and say, this is the interior Indigenous identity. We never do that because it doesn't make any sense to do. 100 miles to the west or 100 miles to the south, that resource set is completely different and our cultures have evolved differently. And what's allowed us to maintain our identity is marrying our protocols to those specific data sets, the resource sets. So this is about moving away from these pan-Indian ideas that all Native people believe this, or all Native, two-eyed seeing means that all Native people have this second set of eyes where it doesn't work like that. There's Krunacha eyes, there's Wapmuk eyes, there are Okanagan eyes, there are Sinaics eyes. It's not this kind of amalgam. Next slide, please. So in the last few years, the primary focus has been to move to this idea where we are these autonomous decision-making groups. We went through this process where Indian agents and some of the other structures around us, and then later some of the other kind of local, provincial, and other federal programs, they took that autonomy away from us. We stopped being able to make our decisions that were important, like maintaining language, spirituality, even how we got to raise kids, how we got to have children. So that went away. And then we became these managed communities where we couldn't leave our reserve unless we had a little ticket, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or something. Like, you can't go to the next community if someone doesn't give you everything you're doing is being managed, because you're a domestic dependent person that we don't really want doing the things that you've always done. And then, especially for our community in the 50s and 60s, we started to allocate some of those centralized skills under umbrella corporations, the Kootenai Okanagan District, Kayak, and then later even to KKTC and what is now the Ktunaxa Nation Council. We've allocated some of those resources we couldn't specifically have in our 4 different communities, and we put them under an umbrella. Western researchers really tended to focus on things like implementation science. It was free of context. We just want to interview you and then use your data the way that we want. And the goal there was this process called knowledge translation, where in a vertical silo of Western researchers, they got really good about moving information from the researchers up to the analysts, to the decision makers, without kind of distorting them at all. But the primary problem was those vertical silos. They improved translation and communication within a silo, but never with the Indigenous people. We're kind of like an afterthought. So now we need knowledge translation between Western research organizations or functions or programs and Indigenous research programs. We have our own research ethics committee in our community. We have a board of elders, language speakers, and knowledge people that are a continual point of conversation with external researchers to make sure that there is a constant ebb and flow, a back and forth of ideas with respect to research data. And I get to spend the rest of my afternoon with them. As soon as I'm done here, I get to log on and hang out with them. And this also includes intellectual property. Our research ethics process makes sure that it spells out, you never own our data, it never belongs to you. We will write you a letter so that it can be included in your thesis or dissertation or in your federal funding, saying you've met our requirements. You can use them for one very narrowly defined research project with a specific research question with a stated methodology. You don't get to use it and then keep using it every time you come up with a new idea. This provides assurance to Indigenous participants. Again, we're not subjects, we're your participants, that we can share information without fear of losing it. Because if we're afraid of losing it, we're not going to tell you everything, and you're going to get a very limited data set, and it's not going to be helpful for you or me or anyone. Next slide, please. And when it comes to our own community, there's just a few ideas here that I think are worth kind of driving home again. Again, these are not things that someone told us to do. These are things that we did on our own when we started to realize that there were big gaps in the way that we understand our data, really the way we understand ourselves and the way that our identity relates to these resources. So a few of it says Indigenous here, but these should all say because we're moving towards being specific. But Indigenous languages each have unique stories describing how humans and all things came to be. Each nation has a unique language and culture that attaches to a particular place. There's no more pan-Indian, all native people feel like this, or generally native people feel like that, or when you go to the interior, the prevailing idea is. Those aren't helpful, and those actually make it harder for us to feel comfortable working with you. It's specific to us, and we're not ever talking about anything kind of amalgamated or a general representation. It's specific to us. Our intellectual property encodes our protocols, the way a group solves problem or shares information in a traditional problem-solving setting, or the way information flows through our community members to make governance decisions. They're specific to us. They don't work for anyone else, and they're not a talking circle. That's the most pan-Indian, unuseful thing I've ever heard. It's not that we all sit around in a circle and we get comfortable and we kind of stick with a feather on it to the next person. We're solving problems the way we've done since the beginning of time, and it always starts with our elders. So these properties that we're talking are specific laws and norms in our community. They're collectively owned, and they describe the relationships of us in reference to our land, particularly our water, our stars, our creator, our spirits, all of those other things that are around us that make up our land. They're specific to us, and they're our understanding of them. Intellectual property includes identity, resources, artistic expressions, language, technologies, oral and written records, all manifestations of our culture, including the data that relates our culture, identity, worldview, history, and future. So not just research that was done 100 years ago, but research that's going to be done 100 years from now. The Ktunaxa are an indigenous group comprised of Ktunaxa speaking peoples from both sides of the border. I get to spend tomorrow with our community in North Idaho with a bunch of our kids that spent yesterday on the Flathead Reservation in Montana. It's the first time I will have seen anyone from my community in almost 2 years. It's going to be amazing, even if we just sit around and joke around and tell funny stories and say A's and that kind of stuff. It's going to be really good. But we all speak the common language, but that should not be interpreted as we all have the same culture or the same history. Every one of our communities is a little bit different, especially the two on the southern side of the border. So you can't even just say there's a generalized Ktunaxa culture. The lower Kootenai Band and the Kootenai Tribe of Idaho, their language and culture is different from the other. So now we don't just have differences between our speech community and other speech communities, but even within our speech community, there are differences that have to be understood. And that's a big thing, especially working with the lower Kootenai communities. They're really clear about putting their foot down and saying what we're talking about is specific to our community, and we don't want to answer research questions that have to do with Upper Ktunaxa because we have some things that are different that need to be highlighted here. So that's an internal change that we had to make to fix that relationship. We have all kinds of systems of collecting data related to our environment, our social, our political, our economic structures. We have systems to collect, record, analyze data, and communicate across time and distance, from the earliest of the pictographs all the way up to the newest apps that we have and developed to bring people into this collective understanding. And our groups are entrusted with responsibility for data collection, retention, and analysis. Data is used to inform decision-making at many levels, from the kind of boots on the ground, frontline workers doing research that take direction from the elders and regularly report to them, all the way up to our chiefs and councils and the nation council's executive. It's all informed by this deep discussion of intellectual property, so that way it preserves some of the nuanced context of our worldview. Next slide. Coming up with a way to kind of measure who we were was a little bit tricky, and it took quite a long time to do that. Our governing bodies tend to look at things in terms of advancing and protecting individual needs, but also the shared needs or the shared interests of the community. So they're looking after the things specific to us as individuals, to our families, to the clan that we came from, to the band, which is highly associated with reserves, or maybe with other communities not on reserves. They kind of, we have to start thinking about both of these, where many non-Indigenous governance institutions tend to focus not necessarily on preserving individual aspects of identity for people, but that's kind of an added layer. It's an important thing for our band governance structures. Independently, our governing bodies primarily perform functions related to personal jurisdiction, protecting our community members and the environments that they grow in. But also asserts a territorial jurisdiction through the territory that also protects that collective group, or the group identity related to that land base. We do this through self-determined processes, not relying on someone else to tell us. And even places where there were things from, say, the Indian Act that didn't work for us, over time we found ways to adapt them so that there is maybe more use out of those tools to be able to do these things. And if we can't adapt it in such a way that works, we just come up with a new one. The Indian Act never told us we could or couldn't have research ethics communities. So when we couldn't work with the existing structure, we just created one. The Ktunaxa governing bodies collectively assert ownership over our intellectual property and our identity. So you can never come to a community and find one person and say, this is the Ktunaxa identity. There's now a part of this function of governance that represents all of us. So that's one way to think about that. Next slide. And I think I have a couple of pictures here just to cover what I've talked about, and then I'll do a time check and see where we are. The first column here, generalized Western research. Again, I talked about there are all of these links in there. Knowledge translation was just the process of getting them doing better vertical translation of work from community members, through frontline workers, to mid-level managers, to researchers, to analysts, to senior directors, all the way up to the people in charge of funding. There was this focus on having things be better in a vertical sense for non-Indigenous researchers. If we could do the next one. And then we have this kind of evolving Indigenous research, which is not the same thing as pan-Indigenous. This is not two-eyed seeing. How many speech communities are there in BC? That's not two eyes, it's like 40 eyes or something. So we've had to do the same thing that the Western research community has done. Everything from our community members to our language and cultural authority, making sure that they're communicating better with our data gatherers, our analysts, our managers, all the way up to our chiefs and councils, where we're trying to improve the way that we are preserving our data, our intellectual property that's specific to us. The next slide. And the problem is when we put those two groups together, there is this tendency, and I've kind of put the word hypervigilance in there. There's this tendency for community members to be a little bit unsure. We had people from our community that wanted to talk about rights and title, and they wanted to start by asking community members about their place names that their family knew, and things broke down really quickly. And it was very emotional, and people put the brakes on and they said, first off, unless you can tell me who's managing this data set, and then if you can't tell me that myself and my children will always have access till the end of time, I'll never give any of this to you. This is the last of the information. This is the last of my intellectual property. This is the last thing that my community truly owns. So if you can't clarify those things, and you can't make sure that our interests are a part of the consideration from the beginning, then I can't share anything with you. And the lands and resources researchers were just shocked by that. They were like, well, we work for you. And the elders said, you really don't. We've never seen you before. I have no idea where my data goes once I give it to you. So next instance from the slide. So what we're trying to do here is get those two communities overlapping, where from the beginning, any of the research clarifies, this is what we want from a Western perspective. And then it also allows Indigenous people to say, this is what we also need from it. We have research ethics considerations, we have data management, we have data destruction, we have Ocap, we have all of those, making sure that my community member has access, has some ability to be able to make decisions about that data moving forward. If we get those ideas if we find that common ground, those minimum data elements, the things that are important to both groups, and we go back to the elders and we can say, we're not taking things away. This is who from our community will have access. This is the way your community members can access it. These are the collective statements about the intellectual property of the nation. The federal government never gets this data set to do with what they want and make land use and occupation statements or policies or treaties, that this becomes something for our community to negotiate with. Then that kind of hypervigilant wall starts to come down, and we start to see this rich data that works for both research positions, from Western research needs, but also from our community. We start to see that those ideas that are in that overlap, those become the greatest potential for community members to feel comfortable, to be very rigorous in their research, and to engage in data triangulation. Because if someone from a Western research perspective tells us all of their conclusions till they're blue in the face and how they meet the conclusions of 100 other Western researchers, those don't mean anything to us, and you need to stop talking until what you're saying matches up with all of those studies we've done in our community. Then your 3-ring binders don't mean anything. It's about data collection and triangulation. It's about a process that is rigorous from both perspectives. And the only way to do that is to make sure our research questions, our epistemological considerations, our methodological, the way that we gather data and share it has to be incorporated from the beginning. Otherwise, you might as well just go to a library and do archival research, because we'll never give you access to that oral history, to that intellectual property, to those identity resources, which are a constant way that we use to relate to one another, to reflect to and react to what's going on in the world around us. And what you'll have is another archival library project, which will never triangulate what we're talking about, will never add to our identity, and it never becomes this part of our intellectual property. The primary tool for doing this, or a good tool for doing that here, is UNDRIP. And I don't know where I am on time, so I think I'm going to turn it over to Gwen to make sure that I don't talk through the whole thing. But this process now, this is like a 27-year process, and we have a number of federally funded research projects through CIHR and SHRC and Indigenous Services Canada, where our process of doing this has met their requirements for funding, for research ethics considerations, for developing our own research based on our identity, that allows us to manage our world, including our governance structures, and inform them in a way that's consistent with what we've done since the beginning of time. And hopefully, unless we all burn in forest fires and lose our land, or unless there's another pandemic that causes us all to kind of break down and stop interacting, we expect these processes to continue to guide the way we interact, the way we share information, the way we solve problems and govern ourselves from this day moving forward until the end of time.
Wow. So I'm hoping that all of you enjoyed that as much as I did. Christopher, you're bang on for timing. You did an awesome job. There's an opportunity now, if you just want to click the next slide, just a brief pause here to reflect back on the information provided. If you have questions, you can, I think, drop them into the chat box, and we'll try to field a few of those questions. But also at this point, if necessary, people to take a drink of your tea or coffee, run if you need to quickly to go to a washroom or other facility. And we will start with the other section of the presentation in just a moment. So I'm hoping that all of you caught that website at the beginning of the presentation. And if not, when you download the slides, you'll get a link to Christopher's website, and you'll be able to read a lot of what he's done. Hear some of the music he's created. That is pretty deep music, bringing some of this really deep thought into a technological musical space. It's quite interesting. So I really hope that you've enjoyed this presentation, this component of it, and that we will, of course, see Christopher supporting, of course, our nation and other nations across British Columbia and perhaps across Canada as we advance the First Nations data strategy, which at this point is really focused on governance. And I think that this piece of work that Christopher's just spoke about, although it's foundational to the Danuka Nation, It is foundational to all nations to do this type of work as we think about what nation rebuilding is. And I think that there's been other groups and other governments sort of putting their spin on what it means to them. But as Christopher mentioned, it's about what it means to us. So if there are any questions, Bronwyn, that have made their way into the chat box, maybe we can pose a couple to this time.
I
haven't seen any yet, Gwen. If anyone would
Okay.
like to ask their question out loud too.
I saw a
you can
question
raise
about
your hand.
I saw a question about OCAP, and I wanted to address that one just a little bit. I went to a conference in New Zealand and I was presenting, or I was watching a presentation, and someone got up and started talking about OCAP and started talking about Gwen and how OCAP was this amazing thing. And I had to remind them that OCAP was like a thing that we came up with in the community a long time ago. And then someone trademarked it, and then were telling us how we could or couldn't use it. So I was like, if you're going to talk about Gwen, you should have Gwen here, and you shouldn't be talking about how OCAP was this great tool to empower people. It's the perfect example of how an idea from practical use in data management in our community became this trademarked idea that we were expected to use the way that it was trademarked and defined. And I thought that was a little bit crazy, but for those of you that don't know, ownership, control, access, and protection of data.
Possession
of data. It sets forth some of these expectations about, if you're working with Indigenous people, that there are 4 really important ideas that have to be talked about there before you go any further. And I think Gwen is probably the best person to clarify a little bit on those.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And actually, that's a segue into, I think, the next part of the presentation. So if you do come up with any questions, just post them in the chat. We'll get to those questions. And in fact, in follow-up, any questions that are posed, we'll try to put into an FAQ as we move these processes forward. So the concept of OCAP, of course, many of you online probably know of it because it has been around for probably almost 30 years now, 20 at least. In that it is a set of principles that were developed in that research space by First Nations pushing back into that research space. And so it was a set of principles that was never intended to be the be all end all and the standard for all nations, but it was to bring awareness that there is a standard that each nation would be bringing to the table. So ownership and control, who owns and who controls, that's to each nation putting themselves in it. Access and possession, how do we ensure that those who access and possess our data are doing it in the right ways? So when that initial acronym was turned into a real philosophy that was then looked at training up others, and it was about the same time that I was brought on to the National First Nations Information Governance Center Board. And so it was one of the very first exercises that I was actually exposed to at that common table, which is a corporate table where we sit to do those national surveys. And the OCAP principles were thought to be at that point, needing to be trademarked. And I actually, as a director at the FNIG, voted against the trademarking of OCAP because it then brought it into Canadian intellectual property space and meant that that institution, that corporation, FNIG, owned that intellectual property. It didn't mean we owned it as Indigenous people. It wasn't quite understood that many years ago what I was speaking of, but we've evolved since that time. And a lot of people have thought about it quite deeply, I think, since that time. And I think that's where we are now, is with the reckoning that no organization and no institution other than those of our own creation as nations has the right to define what ownership, control, access, and possession means. So we each nation in Canada needs to take that acronym and put ourselves into that ownership space. So go ahead and click for me, please, because there's been a time, or there's a time now like there's been never before. And that now, as Christopher was mentioning, is the time of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And even though this declaration has been around for quite a while now, it's not really had any traction. And even in the day and age we are in now, where BC's passed it into law, federal governments have got law in looking at the declaration, it still has no traction, it still has no meaning. Just like OCAP has been sort of a space and a place marker in a philosophy. It doesn't really become anything concrete until we take it ourselves and make meaning of it. So this declaration is full of many, many articles. I'm sure you read them when they were penned all those years ago in that international space. And again, when it was discussed here in British Columbia and in Canada, formulating this law. But what each one of these articles mean is yet to be defined. So thinking about this statement about us having the right to maintain, control, protect, develop their cultural heritage, knowledge, traditional knowledge and traditions. Who's the they? Who's the they and the them? Every time I read these types of documents, it's like, that's nice, but who's they? They have the right. And they talk about Indigenous peoples. Is that me and Christopher and Mary and Sam and Paul and Judy? Or is that the Tunaka, the Ntlakapan, the Staklium, the Swampy Cree, the James Bay Cree, the Northern Cree? Who is that? We know who it is, but they don't know who it is. So again, we've got to kind of put ourselves into this picture here. There's a lot of rights that are waiting for us to take, into our governments and make into responsibilities for ourselves. But there's a leap to making that happen. Click, please. So even though there's what I would say recognition of our sovereignty in UNDRIP language, given that sovereignty really is acknowledging that we are the supreme rulers or the ones with authority over something. Nobody else has authority over who we are as unique societies. And Christopher was not acknowledging BC, we've got 34 plus language groups. Canada, approximately 88 at this time. So this declaration is a powerful, powerful instrument, but it's really meaningless until, again, we step into it. Who are we? Until we start to figure out how we're going to make meaning of it. So states are supposed to be providing redress, which of course is compensation or to help us rejuvenate or reclaim and to bring back to a state that we want them to be in. And they're supposed to provide that redress for things like respect to our cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property taken without free, prior, and informed consent, or in violation of our laws, traditions, and customs. Now, I'd be so bold as to say that everything that's happened to us from the point of colonization up until what's still happening right now is a violation and continues to be a violation, even in the way that the legislation is being drafted and implemented at this point. And I'll say why I feel that in just a moment here. This is also acknowledging, again, what Christopher said, it's not about just historic, we can reclaim our historic identity. This is about us having the systems and the capacity, the ability to actually transmit, to rebuild and to transmit those good things to the future generations so that they never lose their identity again. Because many of us are getting a little tired of being called Indigenous people. From my history, I've been called an Indian, and I'm still an Indian under the Indian Act, but an Aboriginal person, a Native person, First Nations person, now an Indigenous person. We've had so many politically correct names afforded to us. But until somebody says to me, oh, you're Tunaka, and then I think there's still a sense of things are not quite right in the world. Click, please. So when we think about identity and nationhood, as Christopher says, it's so deep, it's so integral to who we are in relation to our intellectual property, our language, our connection to our land, and all of the knowledge that comes from those connections. So in UNDRIP, they talk about Indigenous peoples, and they talk about nations, and they talk about rights. But there's a difficult time in actually making the leap between where does an Indigenous person fit in relation to an Indigenous nation, in relation to a community government, in relation to an Indian band, in relation to all of these terms that are still in use today. And so, again, the UNDRIP recognizes that every Indigenous individual has the right to a nationality. So again, we have Indian bands in BC that are now taking the persona and we're now called communities because that's a more politically correct term. But many of us recognize that we historically had way more communities than we have now. The reservation process, that's colonization process, dismantles a number of our communities and a number of our communities disappeared because of smallpox and other processes, other things that happened to us. So we have the rights to do things. We don't have a lot of resources. We would hope that once we can stand ourselves up and say, this is who we are, these are the plans we have, these are the investments we need, that we can actually trigger some changes through the federal fiscal framework reform that's taking place, and perhaps have direct funding to our nation groups. So click one more time, please. This declaration talks about minimum human rights standards. And in British Columbia, there was a report produced recently that talks about data and disaggregation of data, meaning that when the province collects data and they can actually look inside of those data sets and find distinct groups of peoples, like us as First Nations peoples, or women perhaps, or youth, or whatever category inside of that data they're actually looking at to disaggregate the data and look at that distinct group, that whenever a group is being looked at, that group has rights to be involved in that data's use. Just as Christopher was acknowledging, it's not a pan exercise and a government controlled exercise anymore, because individuals have rights, humans have rights, but we also have Indigenous rights, and those have to be defined really by each nation. So we have this action plan that's being drafted right now in British Columbia, and there's going to be one drafted federally that is about implementation of those, all of those actions that DRIPA says that they should be acting on. So all of those recommendations made, all of those articles, we could demand that BC DRIPA action plan for the provincial government looks at our relationship to them in the data environment, and that we have agreements with them that are giving us recognition as data owners and with the rights to control our data, regardless of whether they're holding it or an organization is holding it. So this work that the BC Human Rights Office did acknowledged, yes, in BC, Indigenous data governance is recognized and it needs to be acted upon. And so as we look to advance in British Columbia, sections of our DRIP plan, we need to make sure that we're not just doing it in the collective space, although we can do a lot of work there, because in the collective space, we can actually achieve economies of scale and other things, and our voice becomes louder when we speak collectively. But as that collective voice speaks, then each one of our groups has to actually step forward. Click, please. And what that's going to mean is that each one of us has to look back to our nation group, our nationhood. And I know historically there's been this tug and pull because of entities fighting for resources and their processes, the other government's processes, these proposal calls, these kind of pan processes, et cetera, that accommodate their interests, but basically leave us out. People that have no capacity can acquire no capacity. And so as we move things forward in the data domain, it's really about each one of us as unique cultural groups, understanding and reasserting our connections to our land, reclaiming our language, which is really where the crux of our culture, our connection to our land and our language, and our citizens then starting to help us take shape over governance again, setting the standards for ownership and control of data that meets our worldview, that meets our interests over time. When we establish institutions, our own institutions, to manage processes or to serve our citizens, they would be accessing and possessing data that people give them. So if I go into a health office and receive a service, that's my data in that health file. But as soon as it's brought into a broader aggregate, and now it's looking at the status of health people in our communities, that is sort of data managed at an aggregate level. It's population data. And so our nation, our community governing bodies are responsible for setting standards around that. We have to be the ones to determine what matters in measuring our future well-being, because we're still stuck in a system that wants to measure deficits. They're still looking to measure how sick and unfit and unwell we are. And again, that's easy to do. We can tell when we visit a hospital or we die or we have a disease. But our concepts of well-being, they have no idea what they are. And so each nation, each group has to actually take that on. They have to take that on and assert their nation's controls over their data and controls over their identity. And as we move forward and nations start to do their community planning, which of course is the involvement of all of their citizens, because Indigenous people belong to nations, regardless of where they live. Some of us live in a reserve, some live in town, some live in France. So we've got to include our citizens regardless of where they are. And our citizens, of course, choose their governments. So as we move the national data strategy forward in BC, we're going to be working with the FNIG, as the we here, First Nations Information Governance Center, working with each of the unique cultural, linguistically cultural, unique groups in BC. And so bringing the Indigenous governing bodies together, having them come together in a common space so that they can begin having the conversation about protection of intellectual property and assertion of ownership and control of identity, and then of course the data that relates to their identity. And so data sovereignty is really just setting a standard, just telling the other governments, whoa, nobody owns our data but us. We own our identity, the collective identity of the we. As an individual, I self-determine, but together we're all Tunacha, we're all together Tunacha. So as Christopher was mentioning, for us, no one individual has the right to determine the standard for us. Collectively, we will do that, and our governments will then ensure that those standards are met, regardless of whether that data is being held by another government or within one of our own institutions. Click, please. This is so important again in BC because I had a minister from the provincial government say to me not so long ago, Gwen, how am I supposed to have a meaningful relationship with 200 Indian bands? And I said, by breaking those relationships down from these big plenaries, this was at a big provincial meeting where they usually come to meet us, breaking those big tables down to the level where you can actually meet those governing bodies at their nation level. So within their own homelands, set the table, we'll set the tables, you just come and meet us. This map is from the First Nations or the First Peoples Cultural Foundation. So there's a website in BC, First Peoples Cultural Foundation website and First Voices that do a lot of work in BC to support nations in language. And they've actually got a lot of data on their websites that talk about and actually align the nation groups in BC with the governing bodies with the nation identity, linguistic nation identity in BC. So it's a wealth of information for us in British Columbia that already helps us to move our interests forward. I'm not sure what the other provinces and territories have, but I know at the federal level, if you are like me and you watch every piece of legislation and every piece of work that's going on, you are probably sadly disappointed to see that the national language law that was passed did not even include a list of the languages of Canada. So we've got Indigenous language legislation that doesn't even recognize what those Indigenous languages are. So yes, we have got to put ourselves in this. So click again, please. So right now, based on First Peoples Cultural Foundation information, these are the unique language groups of British Columbia. And so each one of us has to take ownership as the peoples who own these languages, as the people who speak these languages. So if we think about, again, the work in data sovereignty, which is what we're focused on right now, it's about each nation taking control over their identity and asserting through a very simple declaration. It doesn't have to be something fancy, some very simple declaration to say, we are the people, this is our language, this is our territory, relate to us differently. We are the groups you need to relate to in implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So Indigenous peoples, as the unique peoples that we are, not a collaborative, collective, or not a homogeneous whatever population, but or all of us together, but each one of us as the populations we are, the unique populations we are, we have got to do this. We know historically that each one of us knows who our neighbors are, who knows who the nations are around us, because historically we would have either had opportunities to relate and share and trade, and at times would have had to fight those neighbors for defending our territory and the resources within. So we know each other. It's just these other newcomers that have been here for the past 150 or 200 years. They don't know who we are. So we have to reclaim our identity, and then through that demand that we are related to differently, invested in differently, and more importantly, that we're the ones to determine what it is that matters to us and what we will measure. So we will take data sovereignty, then we will assert and start building the capacity to implement data governance. So the sovereignty component is really just setting out that we are the ones who own our identity. And then the governance work is actually to start making it happen, which is about creation of different types of instruments and agreements, et cetera, over time. Click, please. In BC, again, because we have the most diverse population of any province or territory, actually, in Canada, it's been challenging. And some of our groups are very small, like my own nation. We're 4 communities in BC. Historically, we had about 13 communities or more. But right now, there's 4 in BC, 1 in Montana, 1 in Idaho. And so it's challenging for a small group to do some of their work, but we can work together. But we can no longer allow them to say First Nations peoples in this collective voice in British Columbia without actually acknowledging all of us in our uniqueness. So it's going to be a challenge for them, the other governments, to actually figure out how to say, number one, each of our names, because we hear them and it's a challenge, but to know who we are, to actually know who we are. So we've got our work cut out for us. They've got their work cut out for them. But this DRIPA Act and all of this planning they're doing can't actually take any, like I say, efficacy can't actually take effect until we say, this is who we are. So we're at a point now where this national data strategy that BC First Nations leadership have called for through all of these big political forums, and the shift from the FNIG to being sort of a corporation that was sort of doing big surveys to serve the other governments, that organization's vision is now that each nation achieves data sovereignty within their own worldview. And so that corporation nationally is intending to, over the next couple of years, work with the nations in each province and territory to discover how to structure governance over institutions that would be directly accountable to and perhaps receive the delegation of their functionality from each of the nation governments. So for Indigenous governing bodies in BC to delegate authority to an institution, to serve them as a public service institution, a First Nations public service institution, that's kind of what we envision over the next while. That this work will support each nation to achieve data sovereignty. And we can do some of this early work by even helping them to know who we are, to lay out for the other governments, this is who we are. And so we're going to share with you today, click please, an example of a document that I drafted that can actually help us to do this work. And perhaps in the next 6 months to a year, we could have a whole different table set, a whole number of different tables set to move all of these big commitments around DRIPA and the in plain sight report and the murdered and missing Indigenous women and everything that they're trying to do to us, with us, for us, to a different level so we can actually make it real. And so the other day, just thinking, you know, Tsilhqot'in have negotiated or demanded or pushed for and got a lot of their rights recognized in these different court structures. And I thought, gee, it'd be interesting to take that DRIPA in its you know, way it's written right now and to insert somebody into it. And so I thought about the Tsilhqot'in, and I just took the Tsilhqot'in and put their name into DRIPA articles. The Tsilhqot'in peoples have the right to the full enjoyment as a collective or as individuals. The Tsilhqot'in people and individuals are free and equal to Tsilhqot'in peoples in exercising their rights. So I'd suggest that each one of us nation groups across Canada takes that DRIP and inserts your name into it. Do a search and replace. Identify your governing bodies. Do a search and replace. So that DRIPA then actually is an acknowledgement of your people's rights. And then over time, you start to define what those rights are to your people, not having them be in this generic plenary, you know, common space where Indigenous peoples have rights. Until we can actually zone in and know what that right is and actually put some metrics to it, some measurements, how do we hold them accountable? How do we know that our rights are actually being moved from the static place into actually something that is alive and being recognized? So that's the first thing I'd suggest every one of us do. Just take that simple language of DRIPA, search and replace, put ourselves into it. Click, please. And the second thing I'd like for us to think about doing is to acknowledge that we do have data sovereignty and to recommend through whichever forum you're sitting in that in British Columbia and in other provinces and territories, there are, you know, similar institutions that are doing similar work, but in British Columbia, that as we unfold this data strategy, and we look at the DRIP plan that's in place right now, that we demand that it has a space in it for tripartite data quality and sharing agreements that are government to government and nation to nation. Right now, there's an existing data sharing, quality and sharing agreement in place in BC. There's some in the other provinces and territories, not all of them, but it's held by an institution, an organization. And in BC, it's the First Nations Health Authority that has it with the province and the federal government, and allows them to find us, the First Nations people, inside provincial data by using our status numbers. They're using our data without our informed consent, because when that agreement was negotiated over a decade ago, it was negotiated by political groups, and we were, not thinking DRIPA back then. But now is a different time. So the province knows this data sharing agreement is due for re-signing, and it needs to be renegotiated. But I would suggest that it should not be with an organization. That organization serves us as nations. We can delegate a function to them. But what we need to do is take this tripartite data quality sharing agreement and look at it again in our own terms. And our next webinar in a couple of weeks, we're going to focus down on a TDQSA that exists in BC and talk a little bit about what it means and how it could actually apply at a nation level. So we're going to do some of this work to help in a collective space so that each nation can actually take it and make it their own in their own space. So a little templated work that we will do over the next while. And in doing that templated work, click please, there's another thing I think that's really important for us to think about, is how we might delegate to a BC data center, which is part of the national data strategy, not just that we all have data governance, but that there's an institution that we've authorized and developed to serve us. We determine how it'll be governed and how it'll function. That we never, as Christopher says, give our intellectual property to anybody else. This data center would be governing to the standards we set, and they would be serving the nations. And each nation would determine what they would do for it. So if one nation needs full support for everything from data collection through analysis, through reporting, et cetera, then the center would scale their functions in accordance with what that particular nation needs. This work is just starting. So over the course of the next couple of years, we'll be working on governance of the center, the standards and the model, and getting to that place where we have nation-to-nation relationships amongst ourselves and empowering this institution collectively to serve us. So we will be as I say, over the next little while, getting more templated resources to you, having more discussions. And as soon as we get the money out of budget 2021, I hope you've seen that the National Data Strategy will be funded, but we've got no money flowing yet. As soon as that resource starts to happen, each province and territory will be building a data champions team. So some dedicated staff to actually help move this work forward, because I right now am a volunteer on most of this stuff. We're all volunteers at the FNIGC board table. And so I have the blessing of my nation to do this work, but without that, I wouldn't be able to do a lot of this in the common space. So click, please. So at this time, and I want you to pay attention to this particular slide and the next one. There's a program funding available that you probably don't even know anything about. And if you do, I'm surprised. The Indigenous Intellectual Property Program grant supports Indigenous peoples' IP awareness and capacity building, but it's not in Indigenous services, it's over there in innovation, science, and economic development. And not many of us are actually cruising that direction. So sometimes we don't know that there's funding available to help us because it's not, it's being held by somebody that we don't generally relate to. So this grant is live right now. And there's also at the in global space, international space, the World International Intellectual Property Organization that helps groups all across different countries look at intellectual property interests that might be of a global nature. And of course, the majority of us along the 49th parallel as First Nations governing bodies, the majority of us actually have nations on both sides of the border, community governments living on both sides of the border. So on the next slide, please click, you'll see the website for this information. And you'll see that the grant is going to close on September 8th. So there's a quick turnaround time on this. As far as today goes, I'm not even sure how long the website posting has been out there, but I would encourage you to put your name in if you can, and even if it's just a letter of intent and you're reminding them, and even it's just an assertion to say, how dare you? You need to relate to us differently, Canada. You know, making sure that we're raising the awareness that you can't keep treating us like it's a program that, you know, who's going to apply to this? We don't know. Why are you not investing directly? Oh, because you don't know who we are as the language holders, as the rights holders over our identity. You don't know who we are. So again, until we can stand ourselves up, say, this is who we are, direct those investments to us, we're still going to be stuck into these, you know, granting processes, which in my mind are assimilative, which in my mind are actually go against the principles of UNDRIP, which say that their processes should not be forcing us into assimilation, et cetera, that they should be acknowledging us as a unique people. So there's a work for us to do in this common governance space to keep pushing at the province, pushing at the federal government, pushing at Treasury Board, pushing at every central agency, because they don't necessarily know what the right hand and left hand are doing. So one more click, please, because I'm going to share with you what this is a to-do list that basically a number of things you can start doing right now to help people. If you work with Indigenous people, help them. If you are an Indigenous person, help your nation. If you're an Indigenous nation governor, or work with your people to do these things. But identify your people as a distinct society, et cetera, as I've mentioned. I'm going to share with you a document in a minute that'll help you do that. Assert you have these rights. Assert you have these other rights, et cetera. Give notice. But also think about establishing a mark of your own, symbols that acknowledge your nation's intellectual property. Just like we have the little copyright, trademark, blah, 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 like you'll see Ocap now with a TM little thing for Canadian intellectual property ownership. We should be developing our own as Indigenous governing bodies within a nation entity. So think about doing that. So again, one more thing I'm going to share with you, click. And this is, again, we're going to give you these documents in a Word format after this presentation. And this I'm going to give to everybody so that they can take this template, put yourselves in it. All right, so you've got a little blank there, just a blank, so you can go search and replace in Word, put your nation in there, put your governing bodies in there. So this Declaration of Data Sovereignty, this document that I'm suggesting that you actually bring to your nation level, through your Indigenous governing bodies, because that's important. Because again, all of this law that's around us now speaks about Indigenous governing bodies. But who are they? Well, I've heard people say, you know, FNHA is an Indigenous governing body and FNIGC is an Indigenous governing, and I'm going, no. Those are First Nations public service agencies. Those are the governing bodies are those who are selected by the peoples who have rights. They're the rights holders. Those governing bodies are the rights holders on behalf of us as unique societies, not organizations, but government bodies, our government bodies. So for the Tsunaka in Canada, there are 4 governing bodies. They're listed there. So if you are the Secwepemc peoples, you would want to have all of your, I believe, 17 governing bodies listed there, etc. So whoever you are, put them right in there. So through this, what you're doing is taking, again, those UN declaration terms and words, but making it a very simple declaration you can make. Click, please. That takes those global terms and makes them real in your own terms. So this next slide talks about that you're sovereign, that you have for millennia worked together to do work together, that you are asserting ownership of your intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that you assert ownership over the data that relates to your people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all this is an assertion of sovereignty. It's an assertion of your rights. It's not governing yet. You're not doing the details of how it's going to be carried out. You're just making this, the assertions. And that's really what we talk about with sovereignty. It's assertion. Then governance is actually getting down and actually practicing. It's putting things into place where you'd get to the actual level of having policy and procedure to back up all of your values and your principles that you have as peoples. So one more click, please. And then this last piece of this declaration document would have each one of your governing bodies sign the document. So either each one sign in their entirety with a page that appends to it. So you have every one of your selected officials. And I say selected because some of you might have want to include not just the elected governing people, but also your hereditary leaders in this. And that's a very important thing to think about as you assert intellectual property ownership, taking it to that point where it has cultural legitimacy in terms of your own worldview, but also giving those other governments the information they need to relate to you at the level that you need to be related to in order to actually bring DRIPA into the Tsilhqot'in have rights, the Intlakapan have rights, the Shtakliam have rights, the Nuu-chah-nulth have rights, so that we can see ourselves inside of this rights space and turn them from rights into actual reality. So that's the end of the presentation. Again, if we have questions that relate to either Christopher's component or my component, feel free to either put them in the chat or put a hands up here. But in 2 weeks, we will be speaking a little bit more to the level of data agreements. So looking at a community-driven, nation-based tripartite data quality sharing agreement conversation. And then we will develop a template for that. We haven't had the resource or the time yet for that. But that would be an extension of this particular piece. So with this declaration, your nation group, your governing bodies on behalf of your peoples are basically setting yourselves in that place where you are now to be related to differently by those other governments. And so it's setting that table to have the conversation about being the ones to take control as the owners of your identity. So putting Ocap into terms that are actually legitimate within your own cultural worldview. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time.
Thank you, Gwen.
I see a couple of questions and I've got to get going to my next meeting. So if I could take a couple minutes, I just want to briefly address them. And thank you for adding them into. I usually don't pay attention to the text or the chat in Zoom, and then I'll just log out of the meeting and someone will say, oh, you had like 12 questions. But this time I actually looked. One person asked about setting up a research ethics committee and having your policy in place, and now trying to kind of fill that committee with bodies. I would say start with community members that are graduate students, because they already had to go through an IRB or a rec process at their institution. So they're good people to bring existing research ethics paperwork processes they've worked on, have them be a part of the conversation, and then kind of do a process where you look and see where those gaps are. But if you can find graduate students from your community that have already done a rec process, they probably already have been concerned. They probably found things they didn't like. They probably already identified some gaps. So that's just a quick suggestion I have there. The next question was on addressing capitalist or profit-driven organizations that have kind of got in and got their fingers in everywhere, and now they're in the middle of everything and they think they're the de facto, policymakers or best practices for that. There's a great paper called Epistemic Exploitation. You should look at that. There are a number of people that have worked themselves in to where they think that they are the experts in an area that they're not even from. And they work as consultants that have all kinds of time to fill out applications and requests for proposals. And your well-meaning community members are working a job, probably community member, probably cultural jobs, don't have the time to take off and compete with them. Find a way under your governing organization, your band council, your nation council, whatever it is, find a way to support community members to apply for and get them some supported time to do RFPs, because otherwise they're always going to be trying to get things done handicapped by having other things going on. But that paper is really good. Anytime that someone who doesn't have to explain or translate everything from their language or culture or position or feelings of collective trauma or individual trauma, they're always going to be able to operate outside of that framework, and all of your community members will be operating from within it. So being aware of that before you do these processes, I think, is really helpful. And I think the paper is actually called Epistemic Exploitation. I think it's just a very simple title like that. And then the last one was making decisions at the community level and how that kind of matches up with individuals. And the only thing I'll say about that is in our community, when we were going through the UNDRIP framework for how a group solve problems, consensus is not a Western consensus where everyone has to agree. It means that everyone gets their input, everyone is heard. No one's told they don't belong, no one's told they're wrong, no one's told that they don't have the right to be there. Everyone gets to share their information, but the decision that's made is made by the decision maker for the group based on everyone's input. It doesn't mean that everyone has to agree, because that's crippling. If you get 10 people, there's a significantly high probability that not all 10 people will agree. But if everyone's concerns are out there and they're all considered, then you have the situation similar to collaboratively rational decision-making processes, where we may not get every single person's concern in a part of this by consensus process, but everyone's concerns have informed what comes out of it. And as long as we make sure that we solicit that information before we make decisions, then it's always in a part of that like thought process. It's always now a feedback loop in there. And when something doesn't work out the best, you already know, hey, remember when so-and-so said this, but we couldn't make it a part of it. We're already started down the road of considering or thinking about what they talked about, even if we can't come up with a policy that works for all 99 people in the room. So that was a really big thing in our community when someone kept trying to work towards a solution that all like 33 people would like. And finally they said, this is not how leadership in our community happened. 100 years ago, the chief asked everyone's opinion. The chief made a decision based on the counsel of the chief's right hand, and then the whip enforced it. It didn't mean that every single person had to agree. That's not actually consensus in our community. That's just a way of bogging everything down and slowing down what we do. So it does look like the paper. And those are just a few of the quick, anyone that wants to follow up with me, Christopher Horsethief at Gmail. The easiest way to send me an email. I think on my website, it goes to my Gmail as well. But I do have a virtual room full of elders waiting for me in another project. I keep getting messages from them.
They're not virtual elders, they're not elders, and they're not going to wait.
They've already started talking about it, and I'm already getting questions that they expect answers to. So I've got to jump over to that one, but thank you, everyone. You could have been anywhere on the planet today, and you spent your time with us, so I appreciate that. And I'll turn any of the other questions over to Gwen, and I look forward to hearing from any of you or continuing this conversation in other forum. Again, also, thank you, Bronwyn. It was good to see you. I haven't seen you for a while, and thank you for your support here.
Thank you, Christopher.
Thanks, Christopher.
So as was noted when we opened, it was going to be sort of a two-part session, one part focused on academics and then the other part looking at governance and how we might be able to work collectively moving forward. But the two are really not separate. They're just parts of a bigger conversation. And there are other parts to that conversation that actually have to be held as well. And so we're hoping that, as I say, that this is just the beginning of people starting to think a little differently in the context and the time we're in right now, and how we can collectively do a little bit of work to position ourselves and perhaps get resources to then do the majority of work we know is so necessary. And for the Tunaqa, when we started to talk about data initially, it was still, as I say, a four-letter word. It's still a four-letter word, but now it actually has meaning to us, where before it was all about the other guys poking us for data. And so that this change that has actually happened at the citizen level as we've been engaging people over the past 25 years, for them to tell us what is a strong, healthy Tunaqa. It's been remarkable. And so the feeling that we, and Christopher mentioned in one slide, the feeling that we have when we say Huninik Tunaqa, it's almost like a warm feeling you get as a First Nations person when you really can say it and feel it and know what it means. And it's something that we want all of our people to move from the space of just being able to say that they're Tunaqa to actually feeling that they're Tunaqa. And that happens when all of our institutions start becoming Tunaqa again. And that means right from the how we greet people when they come into our offices or our facilities to how we report back to them. And so the concept of consensus, it's just like people want that. And so our elders said to us at one point, It's all of us taking a bite of the same thing at the same time. And we chew long enough so we can swallow without choking. Doesn't mean we all agree, like Christopher says, but nobody's gonna die basically without, you know, if it doesn't happen, if this thing doesn't happen. And so it was really starting with a vision for the Tanaqa, and it started with training up some of our younger people that had very little baggage, is what I'll call it. They were you know, fairly fresh horses, training them up in engagement, just in how to sit and talk with people, and then having them be the front face and having conversations with diverse groups. So we talked with youth in their space, and we learned that we couldn't bring more than 4 or 5 together because the dynamic it just didn't work. And then we met with, so knowing your people, engaging your people, and using your own people, training your own people, retraining your people to be leading your people through these processes. Yes, we can have experts working for us and outside people helping us, and we should. But governance is about setting standards, and that is really having to be your own people doing that work. Government, those that work within the standards to carry out the business that you've demanded of them, they can be anybody. But without doing the work in governance to actually reset the standards, we sometimes have institutions that are actually going in a direction contrary to what we actually need and want from them. So data governance, data sovereignty is just setting that place in the ground to say, over the next 20 years, my nation, my people, the Tanaqa people, or whomever, we're going to work on redefining who we are. And we're going to turn, you know, to just rediscover basically how we will measure ourselves moving forward. And other governments, we're expecting you to give us resources so that we can build that internal capacity to start that work. So data governance will take time to determine what it is that matters and how you will measure it. And then information management systems, the technology to support that will come in time. But the real work that each one of our nation groups has in front of us now is that internal work with our people to help remember how strong we were, to remember to rebuild.
Hi, Gwen, for your incredible words today and for sharing all these resources. The chat has been incredibly busy with many questions, and I know we've dealt with some and others we haven't been able to. We haven't been keeping track of them, however, so we'll see if we can send some further resources when we reach out to everyone later this week, and we'll also send the recording and the presentation slides, and would welcome and encourage all of you to join us at the next session on August 17th. And the link has been placed in the chat there, various points. And I would just like to thank you all for joining us today. And Gwen, if there are a few closing words you'd like to share before we come up to noon today, would love to have you finish off the meeting today. Thank you.
I think I actually did that, but I would ask if there's anyone that wants to throw their hand up and just make a comment as we close out today. Please do so. I can't believe it's such a shy group. Well, I will say thank you very much again, for everyone. Please do watch for upcoming sessions. And in any of the other provinces and territories, know that similar work should be going on, is going on. And you can contact the First Nations Information Governance Center, their website, FNIGC. And on there, you can get a list of the directors, the board of directors, and I'm one of those directors for BC. But you can get a list and see the contact for your region, make contact with that individual, and have a conversation about data sovereignty. Thank you, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.